welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon, and today we've got another book review. This is a book I have been waiting to cover because it talks about us as Kemetics. That book is Profane Egyptologists, The Modern Revival of Ancient Egyptian Religion by Paul Harrison. Paul Harrison is now Dr. Harrison. This was his doctoral dissertation, which was released in paperback in 2019. And he cites books and personal responses from many people that are in the online Kemetic community, including yours truly. My first book, Following the Sun, is mentioned in here because that was the first one that I had out at the time that he was interviewing people and gathering sources. So, it covers a lot of relevant topics for us. So many, in fact, that I'm going to break up this review into two parts. And today, the first part we're going to talk about is the basic premise of his study and what he has to say about Afrocentrism, because there's a lot of things in there that I didn't know, and I bet you haven't either. Next episode, we'll talk about what he has to say about one of my favorite authors, and what he learned about various Kemetic traditions online, such as the Kemetic Orthodox and Kemetic Reconstructionism. So that's coming next episode. First off, I do have to warn you, if you get this book and start reading it, have your active reading glasses on, metaphorically speaking, because this is a doctoral level work and it uses a lot of academic language and draws from a lot of theories that modern academic works are referring to, such as Michel Foucault's theory of power. And that's something that informs a lot of modern post-processual archaeology. So be aware of that when you read this. Don't be half asleep, because you're going to have a lot to parse through. But when you do, you're going to find some very interesting things. So first off, what do we think of when we hear the word Egypt? Why do we think what we do? What makes an expert on ancient Egypt? Is that criteria of what makes an expert biased? And if so, how is that bias reinforced? Those are some of the basic questions that Dr. Harrison asks at the beginning of his work. And he cites a study that was done in the year 2000 that was commissioned by a museum, actually. And they were trying to figure out, how to get people more engaged with museum exhibits. And I think, I thought of that study, and I think the results of its findings had an impact on the Ramesses exhibit that I saw last month in Houston, and which some of you may get to see in the future. But this survey was done in 2000 using school kids and adults, some of whom had gone to Egypt and some of whom hadn't, and asked them questions like, well, what do you think of when, you hear the word Egypt? One of the things that this study found out is that a lot of people see modern Egypt as something of an obstacle course, his words, that you have to get through in order to find the real Egypt, the ancient sites and the ancient monuments. And that detail struck me because I think it's very unfair. If you'll notice that I've done videos on modern Ramadan lamps and their ancient roots in Egypt, the festival processions and what do they have that are modern festival processions, in Egypt, ritual purity as it's practiced in modern Islam and how that compares with ideas of purity in ancient Egypt. And by the way, there were similar ideas about purity in ancient Mesopotamia as well. That culture really hasn't changed as much as we might think. It's not like, all the real Egyptians or the real Mesopotamians are gone. No, they're not. And that's one of the points that I try to make in my videos, is we can learn an awful lot about the ancient Egyptians by asking modern Egyptians questions, and learning about what they do. And I know I have a few native Egyptians who catch my videos sometimes, and I'm always grateful because I realize that here I am as an American talking about you guys, and that's something that feeds more into what this author has to say. A big theme that Profane Egyptologists deals with is the observation that our own biases will affect how we read and interpret information. To give you an example, a couple of months ago I did a video on Antinous, and because we don't really know a whole lot about Antinous' early life, you have to interpret on what little information is there. I took the tack that he had been kind of handpicked by Hadrian, whereas there are other folks who commented on the videos who said, well, we don't know that. He could have just been a page and they fell in love later. Either one of those could be true. It's just that I was basing this on other information that we know about, cultural mores at the time, and other folks who are devotees of Antinous and also Hadrian would take it a different way. And I have to own the fact that I have a little bit of a bias, not against Antinous, not against LGBTQ persons, ancient or modern. That's not my problem. I have a little bit of an issue with ancient Romans, especially Roman emperors. Remember, I'm Egyptian pagan. Roman emperors tend to be bad news. And there's a couple of other reasons why I'm, not too keen on Roman emperors. Now, I realize I have some friends and viewers who are eclectic pagan and who honor not only ancient Egyptian deities, but also Roman pantheon and Roman traditions. And you guys are, I guess, going to have to be my Roman redemption, because there was one person who has fallen from grace, and he was a Roman pagan, and that's a long story. But another reason actually ties back to our discussion at hand, because we're talking about biases and what information do we privilege. I call this the privilege of study. Basically, it's this. Okay, if you're in middle school or high school and you know all about ancient Greece or ancient Rome, you can rattle off the myths and the names of the deities and a little of the history and all that, well, people are going to look at you and say, oh, well, you're well-read, you're well-educated, you have a rounded education. But if you know all of that about ancient Egypt, you're just weird. When I was in junior high and high school, I had to deal with that crap all the time. We had to study Greek mythology and read the Iliad and the Odyssey when I was a freshman and a sophomore in high school. And not only did I hate it, but I realized even then that I had put just as much effort into learning about ancient Egyptian history and mythology, and was trying to teach myself hieroglyphs and all of that other stuff for fun. But nobody would give me any respect for it. I was seen as weird. Because Egyptian history is not as considered as valid in, the Western educational system as Greek and Roman is. So on that point, I can totally respect the contention of Afrocentrists that non-classical, being non-Greco-Roman culture, gets short shrift in Western world, again, the Western education system. And because of this, I too have a disdain for classical Western history. Now, there's another reason why I have a bone to pick with the ancient Romans, and I'll talk about that in October when we talk about ancestor veneration. That's coming up. But until that episode, I mentioned Afrocentrism, and that's a big part of what Profane Egyptologists has to talk about. And the chapter that specifically deals with that is called Breaking Down the Doors. Now, what does that chapter talk about? For starters, Afrocentrism itself is a very broad term. And under the umbrella term of Afrocentrism, you have subcategories like continental, infusionist, social, and Nile Valley Afrocentrism, which is the variety that, deals with, obviously, some of the same things that we do. Now, when we think of influential works in Nile Valley Afrocentrism, Probably the first thing that comes to mind is Martin Bernal's Black Athena. And by the way, Martin Bernal is a white guy. This was the first book that contended Western culture, the stuff I was describing about, all drew from ancient Egypt and therefore from Black Africa. That was the first book to get reviewed by Egyptologists. And in Dr. Harrison's words, they have made something of a cottage industry out of reviewing Black Athena. But here's the funny thing, that was not the first work to make that claim. That honor goes to George James's Stolen Legacy, which was first published in 1954 and then reissued in 2002. But you've never heard of it, have you? Me either. Not before reading Profane Egyptologists. But Harrison points out that by ignoring these works and not reading them, analyzing them, talking about them, discussing them, we're only justifying the belief that many of them have that formal Egyptology is biased. I found that to be a very important point to make because I've been curious about a lot of books and media by Nile Valley Afrocentric Kemetic authors, specifically books by Muata Ashby. People have asked me about them, and I've heard very interesting things, but I was influenced by another current viewpoint that is, well, white people shouldn't be talking over people of color. And so I avoided saying anything because I felt, well, maybe it's not my place, maybe I shouldn't. He has a different viewpoint. He says, well, what if there's something important to be talked about in those other books? It could be something good. It could be something that needs to be challenged. But honest critique starts a dialogue. And ignoring other books like that is actually doing them a disservice, even if it's perceived to be politeness. So that's something that probably next year, because my calendar is booked up for this year, but it's a goal in the future for me to look at some of those books and to read them and to share with you what I find out. Because good or bad, ignoring them, as we just said, is a disservice. And that was my intention with the Antinous video too. There were people who had no idea who Antinous was before they saw that video. And there were other people who disagreed with the viewpoint that I had. But we're able to talk about it. If I took the video away, then there would be no more discussion. There would be no reason to disagree or to, to agree. Because, it has to start somewhere. Something has to break the ice, whether it be right or maybe wrong. And that's why I would encourage you, if you haven't seen that video, to go and look. And I gave websites, web links for the other sites in question, and I would encourage you to go and check them out if you're curious. Because I was trying to start a conversation, but I have no intention of being the end of that conversation. True learning means considering as many different angles as possible, and that's one of the things that Profane Egyptologists is trying to point out. And next month, in part 2, we'll look at some more aspects of modern Kemeticism that he talks about. And that was something else he wanted to try to explain, because the terminology can get very confusing. Kemeticism tends to be used more in conjunction with Nile Valley Afrocentrism and the idea of Kemet as a idea of heritage, as opposed to Kemeticism, which is more specific to the modern pagan reconstruction of or revival of ancient Egyptian religion. So we're going to get into that more next episode. And as always, you can join us on Patreon for updates where I talk about things like I'm going to have some videos that I took at the Ramesses the Great and the Gold of the Pharaohs exhibit that we saw in late April. Of course, we have outtakes, and for those of you who have been watching the Marvel series on Disney+, before Moon Knight ever became a thing, we started a little series called Khonsu's Coffee House, and we're going to be talking a little more about Moon Knight and our impressions of it, and that is all going to be a Patreon exclusive. Of course, Khonsu's Coffee House is an ongoing series that we have on Patreon, and we have installments every so often, and you can see those if you go and join our Patreon peeps. And of course, you can catch us Friday nights at 8:30 Central U.S. time for our live services. And, we have more good things coming. So, for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon, wishing you Senebti, and see you next month.
Enjoyed this video? Then be sure to hit like and subscribe to the Kemetic Independent channel. You can also buy my books on lulu.com, and special thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Join us for updates, outtakes, and exclusive videos only on Patreon. Check the description for links.